Beep, 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 beep. Hello. Welcome. Good morning. Oh, hallowed folk of YouTubes and Twitterdoms. Right, how are we all, folks? What a funny week. It's been a funny week. All sorts going on. The loons were out in force yesterday. Did you see? My Lord Almighty, they simply are deranged. I mean, I've never seen such moral degradation. People without any standards whatsoever. None. Absolute moral degradation. And then pretending that you're morally outraged despite the fact that you've got no moral framework that's worth having. It's most extraordinary. So you see all these people, whittering on. However, in amongst the milieu of nonsense, I keep saying milieu, I need a different word. What am I going to... In amongst the miasma of this nonsense, comes a really interesting gem. So, before we begin, Warrior Teacher Programme. Looking full, right? So, I don't think we can get any more on the January, but we're going to, I don't know what the next date's going to be, or the next region, but I'm thinking probably East and West Coast America, and a daytime session, and then, where's the gay men, please? I want one for gay men. So, if you're a gay man and you want to do the Warrior Teacher Programme, let me know. All links are in the doobers as usual. If you can buy me a coffee, that'd be really helpful. Yep. Other than that, let's move on. So this, I might get cut off because I'm going to ramble today. So if you're not up for a ramble, start later or get a cup of tea and let's go, okay? There's a guy called Frank Ferretti. Now, some of you may be familiar with Frank if you've ever been to an FSU event or a decent lecture. I was lucky enough to see Frank 20 odd years ago discussing his book, at that time, Therapy Cultures, which was terribly interesting. About how the therapeutics were infesting our society, which they've done. He was completely right about that, and the results of that. Now, Frank has then written recently another book, which I've read, called Wasted: Why Education Isn't Educating, right? Which is talking about education in general across the board. And what we're seeing is this kind of education that Frank is pointing out isn't in fact education at all, it's indoctrination, is something that is becoming more prevalent as parents are beginning to realise that their children are being sacrificed on the altar of transgenderism and other nonsense. And that is happening because the teachers are practising a type of education which manifests itself really as the belief in critical social justice, or diversity, inclusivity and equity, which seem to be the main vehicles for this pernicious political propaganda that is being fed to children. So this is an interesting piece. It might go on for a while. So as I said, I think this might be quite a long one because it's very well worth us going through and having a look at and talking about a bit. Yesterday it came out. So again, all the links are in the doobers. So let's think about what Frank's having to say about this, which is what he's talking about is what he calls one of the most disturbing developments in Western societies is the alarming speed with which the school curriculum has become a vehicle for promoting political objectives and transforming children's values, attitudes and sensibilities. Now, it's interesting in that I watched or listened to or read, probably all three, quite a bit about people very concerned about PSHE, which is the primary vehicle for this, as Frank later says. But we must be aware that actually the practicing of this type of educational philosophy doesn't stop with PSHE. It crosses every subject and is a template that can be placed over everything in education and subsequently everything within society. That's very important that you understand that, right? It's a template of, right, here's what we're going to do. And Frank explains it extremely well, so we're going to go through some of that as well. The second thing is, I've noticed that it's raised its head again, that parents are unable to get the PSHE to have a look at what their children are being taught about sex education, or as Frank calls it, sexualities education, which is a different thing. So, first off, if they were any damn good at it and they were secure in what they were teaching, they'd organise a session for the parents. I've said that before, I'll say it again. Right, and secondly, actually, it's not just the PSHE. You've got to look at what the whole school's doing, because the whole school curriculum will probably be based on this bullshit that Frank's talking about. So let's give it a go. We'll keep going. So what Frank says here, and this was particularly interesting to me, is he's talking about an approach outlined in 1922 by a man called John Dewey. I know about Dewey, and that's not like me. I knew about Paolo Freire, who's another guy that was all about, get children indoctrinated. But this chap is particularly interesting because unlike Paulo Freire, it looks to me, Freire was a communist practically, it looks to me like Dewey has a far more liberal approach to things, to what Frank is saying here. So let's continue on. Wasted, why education is not educating, in which Frank pointed out that many educators believe that their role is not to socialise young people to embrace the values of their parents and communities, but to undermine them and replace them with what they take to be progressive ones. There's an instant problem there. Who decides that? Well, at the moment, it seems to be the TQ plus nutters, but that's what they're doing. Socialise young people to embrace the values of the parents and communities. No. They teach them to undermine them. It's a political project. So John Dewey said, and here's a quote beautifully summing up, "It is the business of the school environment to eliminate, so far as possible, the unworthy features of the existing environment. As a society becomes more enlightened, it realizes that it was responsible not to transmit and conserve the whole of its existing arrangements, but only such as make for a better future society. The school is its chief agency for the accomplishment of this end." Get it? Right? It is the business of the school environment to eliminate, so far as possible, the unworthy features of the existing environment. Here we go. Well, who chooses? It's almost like what Dewey has done here. There's an old thing from years ago called Maslow's hierarchy of needs. You may remember it. It starts off with, base needs and then goes right the way up to realization, i.e. the idea that you can live as an individual separately from the general morality of the world, still take part in the world, not necessarily break the morality, but you'll have your own moral compass, you'll have your own sense of what's right and wrong, and you'll have your own ideas about what the world is all about. Well, it's almost like Dewey's saying that what we need to do is to forget the development of everything else, including cognitive needs and aesthetic needs and all the needs that an individual has as they develop as a person. We need to forget all that and just go straight to, let's assume you've had a realization, and therefore what we need to do is tell you what your realization is. Well, a realization isn't a realization if it's fed by somebody else, unless it's nudged through education. This is not what this is about, right? Must replace. As a society it realizes it is responsible to transmit and conserve. It is responsible not to transmit and conserve the whole of its existing arrangements. So you cherry pick what comes from the past that you happen to like if you're one of these nut jobs, right? And then you tell the children that's the only bits that matter and the rest are all bad. Decolonise the curriculum, anyone? Right? In practice, what Dewey meant by unworthy features of the existing environment referred to many of the traditional norms that prevailed in American communities. So, family, Star Spangled Banner, all the stuff that comes with it from America, yeah? In effect, what Dewey did was call into question the relevance of values underpinning the outlook of the community that children inhabited. Instead, he proposed that schools should teach children the values that he and his colleagues upheld. Does sound like a liberal, doesn't it? I know better than you do. My knowledge bigger than yours is. It does sound a bit liberal, doesn't it? We must look after those people. It's all that kind of we know better stuff in it. Liberal saviour syndrome. All that needs to be a thing. We've got white saviour syndrome, haven't we? Let's do liberal saviour syndrome. Instead, he proposed that schools should teach children the values that he and his colleague upheld, even if they conflicted with the views of their parents. The interesting thing about when you're growing up as a kid is your parents start, giving you what you need, and we know the basics. Right, we know the basics. We know what the basics should be, and we can see what happens when you don't give kids the basics. But in the TQ plus nut jobs and CSJ nut jobs that flit around the world now, i.e. running EDI apartments or spouting nonsense on Twitter. So we know what happens when you don't get the basics right. Right? People disregard each other, particularly if they're women. Funny that, isn't it? Right? So what's happened is this kind of idea that schools should teach the values upheld by him and his colleagues is he's gone, well, actually our values are. And we've now got in a situation where the values are transgenderism. That's what Frank's going to talk about later. Or the values are that we need to make sure everybody practices critical race theory, not just understands it and knows it and deals with it, but practices it. Same, everybody practices indoctrination. So these ideas of Dewey's have gone out there and they've been grasped by people who have the same idea that he has, which is I know better than you do, which is mostly, middle-class, whinging liberals who actually genuinely do think they know better than the rest of us. It's fantastic. This is why this doesn't this doesn't tend to flow well in working class families, because they know what shit's real. Don't they? You know what I mean? When you're concerned about how much you got money for your meter, you know, or making sure that your kids are raised properly and sending your kids to school, rather than worrying about whether you can get both black and white grapes for your cheese board on a Friday, you tend to know that shit's real. All right? So that's what I think's going on there. Fascinating stuff in my mind. Now, so, since Dewey's time, Frank continues, proponents of socialisation in reverse, which is what this is, have become more aggressive in pursuing their project. Socialisation in reverse. The undoing of generations of understanding of how is it best to get along with each other. Because we have got it better than anybody's ever had it. And people like him, Dewey, do you think they knew when they started, well, we must undo? Or do you think it was done in the best intentions of the liberal mind? I think it's the latter. You've got to watch these devils, right? They're good people. That's the trouble, isn't it? See, it's all done by good people who think they're doing a good thing and then not realising you can't influence that crap. You can't, because people are going to do what they're going to do. And things will meme and change and alter, and then we're all screwed, which is what's happened. So, there's next guy he brings in. This is a great name. It sounds like something out of a boy's own manual, you know, from 1938. Brock Chisholm. Could there be a more American name? Brock Chisholm. No, I should know I said American, he's Canadian. Brock Chisholm, the Canadian psychiatrist and the first Director General of the World Health Authority. This is starting to sound, get your hat. Clearly outlined this ambition in 1948 when he wrote, "A new kind of citizen is necessary if the human race is going to survive." A new kind of citizen. This is creepy shit. He added that a citizen's loyalty should not stop at anything short of world loyalty. From Chisholm's globalist perspective, people had to be detached from their narrow national loyalties and re-socialised as supposedly enlightened citizens of the world. It was up to experts and teachers to save children from their parents. That was in 1948. So that's 88, 2008. Now we're here, 2022. Been a long march, hasn't it? To the point where they've got parents and children at each other's throats. Not because parents and children should be at each other's throats at a certain point in their relationship, but because that being at each other's throats has been inculcated by the state through the medium of education in order to destabilise a society, to bring on the utopia of the likes of Chisholm and Dewey. It's an extraordinary idea, isn't it? It's an extraordinary thread going through time that brings us to where we are and asks us to question, is this true? Is Frank right? Frank's, you know, getting on. Frank. Hello, Frank. How are you? And I've spoken to Frank. He's a very interesting man. But he's getting on. Like some of us, you know, some of us are getting on. He's been around a while, you know. He might have a better rear view mirror view than you. You might want to think about that. Yep. So we need to think about, is this actually what's going on? Is this a root? Is it the root? Is it part of the root? Because I didn't know about it. But yeah, I knew about it. Here's the extraordinary thing. I didn't know about Dewey, but I knew about this. But I came at it from a different point of view as Frank. Now, Frank's written this great article, but I wonder, did Frank start somewhere else and then got to Dewey, or did Frank know Dewey and got to here? I don't know. It's fascinating there. How do we put those patterns together in our minds to understand it? Because I didn't know about Dewey, but here I am talking about the bugger. Right, so, moving on. It was up to experts and teachers to save children from their parents. Chisholm also believed that people had to be re-educated to reject their old-fashioned moral norms. He took exception to a moral outlook that relied on the concept of right and wrong as the basis of child training. He concluded that the fact is that most psychiatrists and psychologists and other respectable people have escaped from these moral chains and are able to observe and think freely. They really do think they're a class above everybody else. Quite extraordinary. Chisholm's rejection of the distinction between right and wrong has been thoroughly internalised by Anglo-American pedagogy. Pedagogy, for those that don't know, is the teaching of children. Andragogy is the teaching of adults. Pedagogy, good word. Accordingly, children are taught to be non-judgmental. Within the system of education, non-judgmentalism is regarded as a foundational value. I think Frank's right about this. Right? I think Frank's right about this. I think people have been taught to be non-judgmental. I don't have a problem with that, necessarily, except what's happened is, because people are stupid, generally, or they will do the minimum to get the maximum. When we talk about non-judgmentalism, what I mean is, our judgments should be non-judgmental. Right? So our judgments about a particular situation, morally, culturally, intellectually, philosophically, whatever it may be, our judgments don't have to be judgmental. That's the hallmark of an adult. So I might be having a conversation with somebody and we discuss whether that person's point of view is moral, for example. This is all in the philosophical sphere, is moral or whatever it may be. And then we would say, well, I don't see that as moral. That doesn't mean I see the person as immoral. Our judgments should not be judgmental. What's wrong with that? It's not a bad idea. It's a good way to start a discussion. Except it doesn't work when you're a kid, does it? Because they don't know bugger all. Right? So you've got to remember that young people don't... if you're 18 years old, the best thing you can do is shut up and listen to other people. It's the best thing you can do. Right? There's an old proverb, probably Chinese because they have the best ones, about sitting at the feet of an older person and just listen. I was intrigued because I was sat talking with the younglings. One of the younglings the other day, we're all sat around a table, usual stuff. I'm looking around the room and I'm thinking, well, actually, this youngling is 18 years old, 19 years old. I think now that's the farthest I can reach into the future. Mull on that. Right? It's the farthest I can reach. To have discourse, to talk, it's the farthest. Now, I probably aren't the oldest person he knows, but the oldest person that he knows is the farthest he can reach back into the past. Right, so between us, if you link it, right, because, my old granny, gone years ago, but my old granny, bit of a character, would fart quietly in corridors. Right, bit of a character's gone long ago, but she was born in the late 1800s. So that youngling who sat in front of me, technically speaking, has got access to knowledge that was formulated, even moral knowledge that was formulated in the 1890s, which she probably got from her mother, was formulated in the 1820s. So me talking to a young person is in a situation whereby I can reach as far as I can into the future. That's the role of a teacher. That's the awesome responsibility of a teacher. And in a world that we live in like now, we're all teachers. You just have to think about that for a while to understand why, but we're all teachers. What these people want to do is interrupt that. The thread that's got us here, sat with 2 phones, 6 screens, 2 PlayStation 5s, a computer, and just about every mod con you can imagine. When 50 years ago, my folk had none of it. It's just insane, isn't it? But that's what they want to do. They want to split it all up, see? Educationalists, I'm an educationalist, educationalists are often assume that poor parenting and the fragmentation of the family is a fact of life that necessitates that schools assume responsibility for forms of socialisation that were hitherto carried out in the home. This is the intrusion of the state into the private life, which you've allowed to happen. At the behest of liberals, and if Frere is involved, which I think he was, and Dewey is involved, it was the liberals and the communists that caused the problem. Gosh. Every society needs to transmit ideas about the conduct of life and the idea it upholds. Previously, such ideas were communicated through an intergenerational conversation about the norms of moral behaviour. In recent time, policymakers and educators have sought to bypass the problem of the intergenerational transmission of values by attempting to use schools to socialise children into values elaborated by experts and pedagogues directly. Teachers, pedagogues, directly. Right now, they're replacing the family with an overarching, I know best, nanny state. It's insane, right? That's what's happening. It's in the article. Go and read the article. I am now approximately 1/4 of the way through the article. This is going to be a long one, isn't it? It is. It is. Perhaps you might have to stop and listen to a bit later. Let's see how far I get before I get cut off. Right. So, the adoption of this approach has important implications for intergenerational relations. This is the most important thing, the most worrying thing of all. While teaching children the latest enlightened value, pupils learn that these views are superior to the antiquated sentiments held by their parents. And boy, do we see this in the way that young people interact with old crusties like me. What do you know, old man? Old, white, cis, het, blah, 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 blah. This is the social experiment in full flow. So they're saying, whilst teaching, these views are seen or taught to make the child or young person think that the views of the old are antiquated. Socialization in reverse, that's a great term, Frank. Socialization in reverse undermines not only parental authority, but it also estranges young and old from one another. The number of people that have said about this, in effect, it turns education into social engineering. Or as I called it, if I recall rightly in one of my documentations on the old subscribals, it's Neuro-Eugenics. Because in order to socially engineer, they also have to interfere with the development of the child, which I think is Neuro-Eugenics. The development of the child with the parents. And the whole point of the parental-child relationship in terms of development, or parental-guardian relationship in terms of that development, is so that the child, when they get to about 14, 15, can start saying, "You're full of shit and I'm off." And they can't even do that anymore. Dependency, right down the line. Let's have some dependency. Because if they're dependent, who are they going to be dependent on when there's no money and no jobs, like they say there is, and you can't get anything because there's no point in trying, because it's all too hard? Gosh, in steps the state. Children are indoctrinated to despise their society's history, says Frank. You bet. They are made to feel guilty about their white privilege if they are white, whereas still they are taught that gender trumps sex, and that, therefore, they should not take their biological sex as girls or boys too seriously. Frank then goes on to explain that actually he's spoken to a number of parents and he's not the only one. Many of them believe that the source of this problem is a zealous teacher or a particular school run by a campaigning head teacher. They don't realise that indoctrination has acquired a systemic character and that some very powerful institutions are orchestrating it. And then Frank goes on to give us an example, one that we are all vested in. Take the institutionalisation of the ideology of transgenderism. Social observers and commentators have gabblers more like, have widely noted the rapid spread of the ideology among the young. The global diffusion of this ideology should not come as a surprise, since powerful international organisations have devoted considerable resources to ensure that transgenderism gains influence amongst school children. The principal medium for spreading this ideology is sex education, which has been rebranded as sexuality education. Unlike sex education, which is principally about sex, sexuality education is about promoting the cultural politics of identity. This approach is aggressively promoted by a coalition of international organisations such as the WHO, the United Nations Population Fund and, drumroll, the United Nations Children's Fund and UNESCO. UNESCO's goals I've spoken about before. There's a Substack, if you remember, that I talked about when in terms of taking over curriculums and changing the way they teach by using a communist-built model where you remove top-level thinking and replace it with activism. It's not tin hat stuff, folks. And you're going to have to do the work. If you think it's tin hat stuff, you're wrong. You're going to have to do the work. This is implicitly built into our development as a species. Don't be fooled, says Frank, by the technical framing of this document, one that's called International Technical Guidance on Sexuality Education, an Evidence-Informed Approach. Don't be fooled, he says, by the technical framing of this, as if it's some kind of dusty idea. Despite its claims to be an evidence-based approach, this is a thoroughly ideological document. The curriculum it offers shifts attention from the traditional focus on biological sex to gender identity. It seeks to influence children to be open to the idea that what matters is their sexuality. That is, their gender identity rather than their biological sex. There you go. There it is. Black and white. So all the links are in the article. The article's in the Dubras. All right. Gender identity, a person's deeply felt internal and individual experience of gender, which may or may not correspond with their sex assigned at them at birth. This includes the personal sense of the body, which may involve, if freely chosen, modification of bodily appearance or function by medical, surgical or other means. That's the definition of gender identity in the document. Gender identity doesn't exist, only in the minds of the lunatics, right? And those of us that have to write about it, or read about it, or talk about it, or teach about it. According to the outlook communicated by this definition, gender identity logically trumps biological sex because biological sex is immaterial, because the human body is forever malleable. Despite the fact that we know you end up with gaping wounds and festering sores and osteoporosis. No, it doesn't matter. We'll stick it in this and we'll teach children about it. They are ghouls of the worst kind. Right. Frank continues, the integrity of the concept of biological sex is diminished by referring to it as something that is assigned to them at birth. Unlike gender identity, which is freely chosen, sex is assigned by others and is therefore of less significance to the life of children sitting in the classroom. And here we go with this profound idea of individualism to the point of self-mutilation, freely and without opprobrium. Following the approach of Chisholm, the World Health Organization, the document, International Technical Guidance on Sexuality Education, is wholly committed to the project of socialization in reverse. The curriculum calls into question the relevance of the values upheld by parents. In the section titled Values and Sexuality, it highlights what it calls the key idea, which turns out to be the following. As children grow up, they develop their own values, which may differ from their parents and guardians. It's such a confused idea with so many of the psychological tropes and fads that have happened in the past 60 years being wrapped into a few lines. As children grow up, they develop their own values, which may differ from their parents or guardians. It's so disingenuous. That's so disingenuous because that's not what they're saying. What they're saying is, before children grow up, we need to make sure they develop their own values that may differ from them before children grow up. You know, until you're about 18 years old, if you've got any damn sense, you pretty much look at other people to get what you want. And they do, right? Once you get to 16, 17, you should start going, hang on, I'm not having that. What? That's bullshit. We should be teaching them to critically think so that they can start to pull it apart and then discuss with others. Well, if they've made a gap between the generations, they're not going to discuss it with others, which means they've got to fill the missing bits that they'd normally get. And they fill it by thinking they know better than the kids and the parents do and giving the kids bullshit like transgenderism. Teaching this key idea that what I've just mentioned, as children grow up, they develop their own values which may differ from their parents. Teaching this key idea can have only one purpose: to undermine the salience of the values held by parents and to diminish their authority. The learning outcomes expected of pupils studying values and sexuality are outlined in the following terms. Now, if you're a teacher, if you're like one of our warrior teachers and you think to yourself, what do I want to achieve? A learning outcome is what you would expect to come from your teaching. By the end of this session, you will be able to, cite X. By the end of the session, you will be able to build Y. You get the idea? So they're saying here, learners will be able to differentiate between values that they hold and that their parents and guardians hold about sexuality, which is impacting on somebody's knowledge, right? Or they will be able to acknowledge that some of their values may be different from their parents or guardians, which is influencing their attitude. And then finally, we'll demonstrate ways to resolve conflict with family members due to differing values, which is talking about skill. They give them the knowledge, they influence their attitude, and then they teach them the skills in order to make sure that the teaching they've received from them is taken into the family to cause division and to open up power and oppression narratives that will lead to the communist utopia. I know it's insane, isn't it, eh? Does it sound insane? Do I sound like a dribbling madman to you? In effect, children are implicitly encouraged to regard the values held by their parents about sexual matters as a fact of life. They are encouraged to consider themselves as the adults in the room who possess the skill to resolve conflict. Where have we heard that before? Ma-mow. With family, right? So they are encouraged to consider themselves as the adults in the room who possess the skill to resolve conflict with family members due to differing values. They're teaching this to kids. It's you that can do it. You're only 13, but you're the key. Mow. Having been socialised to view their gender as fluid, children are tasked with re-socialising their parents. This curriculum fails to acknowledge how children acquire values that are so different from those of their parents. These values did not arise spontaneously in the children's minds. They were acquired through exposure to sexuality educators. Come in, Stonewall and your other bunch of nutters. The curriculum engineers has a great term, isn't it? But that's straight from Bernays, isn't it, Frank? Engineering consent, sucked up by Chomsky with his manufacturing consent. This is where this all come from, Frank, innit? That's what it is, I reckon. Whose curriculum engineers dishonestly fail to acknowledge that their role in socialising children to internalise values that are explicitly different to those of the parents? They don't think they're doing it. They want to think they're not doing it. They think they're doing a good thing. They don't realise that they're undermining foundational stuff. And they'll tell themselves they aren't. There's that cognitive dissonance, the ability to say one thing and do another, you know. It is entirely legitimate to teach values in schools, but not to encourage children to adopt values that are antithetical to those of their parents, which is exactly what they're doing. No, your parents are wrong. Gender exists. It's okay to cut off your body. You can remove your penis. Yeah, you don't have to have a vagina to be a woman. All that stuff is coming from these people who think the same thing. We need a new type of citizen. Let's make them. Engineering. Eugenics of the mind. The promotion of this ideology is particularly reprehensible in primary education. That's really where they want to be, right? Where politically active teachers seek to influence those in their charge. They target children even as young as 6 and 7. For example, in the UK primary school system, children are often taught not to take for granted their gender identity. The transgenderist campaign group Stonewall, whose School and College Champion scheme provides guidance to primary schools, states that everyone has a gendered identity. This is the gender that someone feels they are. This might be the same as the gender they were given as a baby, but it might not. They might feel like they are a different gender, or they might not feel like a boy or a girl. 6 and 7-year-olds. Confuse them, provide a solution to that confusion, become bigger in the mind of the child than the parents are, undermine the parents, destroy the family unit, bring about the utopia. Pure queer theory. Wankers! As it happens, babies are not given a gender, right? They happen to be boy and girl, right? The suggestion that children might not feel that they are boy or girl is designed to encourage them to question their identity, which is rooted in the biology of their body. By encouraging primary schools, Frank again, to cultivate doubts about their biological self, youngsters are indoctrinated into the ideology of transgenderism. Transgenderist campaigners are far more interested in influencing the outlook of young children than in helping them to gain confidence about who they are. Drones. Resistance is futile. You will be assimilated. See? In this essay, I only dealt with one form of indoctrination, the promotion of just the one. And Frank's right, there are far more than one. I dealt with only one form of indoctrination, the promotion of transgenderism through sexuality education. However, indoctrination takes many other forms. In future posts, I would explain how children are taught to be wary of their history and community and to regard their legacy of Western civilization as shameful. Well, Frank, all I can say is it's a stunning piece of work, and thank you for this, and I do encourage you to read it. I realise it's not one of your 10 minutes in the morning read, it's a bit longer, so it's a cup of tea, a thinking cap, and some thought time afterwards might be useful. This is exactly